The keys were still ringing when Ethan Walker's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and cracked against the studio's hardwood floor. And for a moment neither he nor the woman standing at the piano moved to clean it up, because both of them were staring at the same impossible thing across the room. A face neither had expected to see again in this lifetime. Sophie, 9 years old and oblivious to the current running between the two adults behind her, kept her small hands poised over the keys, waiting for her new teacher to say something, anything, while her father stood frozen in the doorway of Bennett Music Studio, with brown liquid spreading slowly across the floorboards. The teacher's name tag, pinned neatly to a cardigan the color of faded lavender, read Claire Bennett, and Ethan had not heard that name spoken aloud in 15 years, though he had never once stopped hearing it in his own head. Claire's hand had gone to her collarbone, an old habit he remembered from a lifetime ago, the way she touched herself there when she was trying not to feel something too loudly. She recovered first. She always had. She knelt, gathered the broken ceramic pieces with steady fingers, and when she rose again, she did not look at Sophie, and she did not look away from Ethan, and in a voice pitched low enough that a 9-year-old lost in her scales would never catch it, she said 4 words that would follow him out of that studio and into every sleepless night for weeks afterward. I never forgot you. To find out how a chance piano lesson would unravel 15 years of silence, and why the woman who broke his heart had spent all that time waiting to say those words, stay until the very end. There will be people watching who think a person should say what they mean the moment they mean it. That silence is its own kind of cruelty no matter what it's protecting. And there will be others who understand that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is disappear quietly rather than drag someone they love into a fire that isn't theirs to burn in. Hold on to where you stand on that, because this story is going to test it. And if stories like this one, about the ones we loved and lost and never explained ourselves to, mean something to you, tell us in the comments where you were sitting when a name from your own past walked back into your life. So many of you watching have carried something like this for years. 15 years earlier, none of this existed. Ethan Walker was 23, working weekends at a hardware store to pay for community college classes he attended at night. And Claire Bennett was the girl 3 stools down at the campus coffee shop who always ordered the same drink and always left a book open on the counter as bait for conversation, though it took him 4 months to figure that out. They fell into each other the way people do at that age, completely and without a plan, spending 2 years building a small, private universe out of borrowed cars and cheap concert tickets and long phone calls that ran past midnight. Ethan proposed with a ring he'd saved for on layaway. Claire said yes. And then, 6 weeks before the wedding, she vanished. No fight, no warning. Just a folded note on his kitchen table and a phone number that stopped working by the following week. He spent that year believing he simply hadn't been enough to keep. He built the rest of his life around that belief, without ever examining it too closely. The way a person learns to walk around a piece of furniture in the dark, without remembering why it's there. He married eventually, Rachel, a warm, unhurried woman who taught 2nd grade and laughed at his terrible jokes. And for a decade his life had the ordinary, unremarkable shape of something good. Sophie was born on a Tuesday in March, and Ethan remembered thinking, holding her, that whatever had happened with Claire all those years ago had simply been the universe clearing a path toward this. Then, 2 years ago, Rachel got sick in the quiet, unglamorous way real tragedies often arrive. Not through some dramatic accident, but through fatigue that wouldn't lift, and a diagnosis nobody wanted to say out loud. She was gone within 8 months. Ethan did not fall apart in any way people could see. He kept working his job managing inventory logistics for a regional distribution company, kept Sophie fed and in clean clothes and at school on time, and he told himself that was enough. That grief handled quietly was still grief handled. But Sophie had stopped smiling in photographs, stopped humming to herself while she did homework, stopped doing all the small unconscious things that told a parent a child was still, underneath everything, all right. It was Sophie's school counselor who mentioned that music lessons sometimes helped children externalize grief they couldn't name. And it was a coworker who recommended Bennett Music Studio, a small storefront on Maple Street, run by a piano teacher, with what the coworker called a gift for reaching kids who've gone quiet. Ethan booked the introductory lesson without asking the teachers. First name? Because why would he? And he spent the drive over rehearsing nothing in particular, thinking only of Sophie, of getting her small hand back around a pencil to draw something joyful again, of getting one more Tuesday, where she laughed at something for no reason. He had no idea he was driving toward the one name he had spent 15 years training himself not to say. 3 months would pass before Ethan understood that Claire's disappearance had never been about him at all. But on that first afternoon, standing in a puddle of spilled coffee with his daughter's small fingers still resting on the keys, all he knew was that the past had just reached up through the floor of an ordinary Tuesday and taken hold of his ankle. The weeks that followed were an exercise in careful, deliberate distance, the kind two adults construct when neither one trusts themselves to say what actually needs saying. Ethan dropped Sophie off 10 minutes early and left immediately, texting instead of walking her to the door, and Claire, for her part, kept every conversation clipped to logistics. Tuesday's fine, we'll work on scales, she's making real progress, as though 15 years of history could be filed away under scheduling. Sophie, meanwhile, was thriving in a way that made the whole arrangement impossible to simply end. She came home from lessons humming actual melodies instead of the flat, tuneless nothing she'd been humming since her mother died. She asked, unprompted, if she could practice for 20 extra minutes before dinner. Ethan watched his daughter come back to life one scale at a time, and every ounce of restraint keeping him from asking Claire the one question that mattered. Why did you leave? Dissolved a little more with each small, radiant thing Sophie brought home from that studio. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, after Sophie had gone into the studio's practice room to warm up, and Ethan lingered in the small waiting area longer than he needed to, ostensibly checking messages on his phone. Claire came out to refill her water glass and found him there, and something in the quiet of the empty room made the careful distance collapse all at once. He asked her flatly, without any of the anger he'd expected to feel, why she left the way she did. No call, no explanation, just a note and a disconnected number. Claire's face did something complicated, guarded and grieved at once, and she said only that it was complicated, that she'd had her reasons, that she hoped he could understand she'd done what she believed was necessary at the time. It was the word necessary that undid him. He told her, evenly but with 15 years of weight behind it, that necessary wasn't an answer, that a person doesn't get to erase herself from someone's life and call the silence a kindness. Claire didn't argue. She simply said she wasn't ready to explain, not yet, and asked if it would be better, for Sophie's sake, if she transferred her to another instructor at the studio. Someone without any complicated history attached. That single sentence landed on Ethan like a verdict. He watched her offer to remove herself again, the exact same instinct that had cost him 15 years ago, dressed up this time as professional courtesy. And something in him went cold and quiet in a way Rachel would have recognized as his particular kind of grief. Not loud, never loud, but absolute. He told her that wouldn't be necessary, that Sophie's progress mattered more than his own discomfort, and he left before either of them could say anything more honest than that. He did not tell her that watching her offer to disappear again had reopened a wound he thought had scarred over completely. He did not tell her that some nights since Rachel's death he had lain awake doing the arithmetic of loss, tallying up everyone who'd left him, and that Claire's name topped a list that now, unfairly, included his wife. Word moves quietly through small studios, and it wasn't long before Claire heard, secondhand from another parent, that Ethan had mentioned to someone at Sophie's school that he was reconsidering the lessons, that the situation with the teacher felt too complicated to sustain. It wasn't true. Ethan had said no such thing, had only vented once briefly, to a coworker about an old relationship resurfacing at the worst possible time. But the rumor reached Claire distorted and final, and she spent that night convinced she had once again become the reason someone she cared about was being pulled away from something good. She very nearly called Sophie's father to formally step aside before Sophie's own excitement changed her mind. The girl had mentioned, unprompted, during a lesson, that she wanted to enter the regional youth piano competition in the spring, the first thing she'd expressed real ambition about since her mother's death. And Claire could not bring herself to be the reason that door closed, too. There is something worth sitting with here, and it isn't a comfortable question. Was Claire protecting Ethan by staying silent all those years ago? Or was silence simply the easier exit, the one that let her avoid the harder conversation of standing in front of someone and telling them the truth to their face? Some of you watching will say a person who truly loves someone doesn't disappear. They explain themselves and let the other person decide what to do with the truth. Others will say some truths are dangerous enough that silence is the only real protection you can offer somebody you love. We'll find out which one this was. 6 months would pass, marked by careful scheduling and unspoken tension, before an ordinary rehearsal for the regional competition forced both Ethan and Claire into a room together long enough that neither of them could keep pretending the past wasn't sitting in the chair. Between them, the 6 months that followed were quieter on the surface and busier underneath. The way a river looks calm from a bridge, while it's carving new channels beneath the surface no one can see. Sophie's progress accelerated in a way that surprised even Claire, who had taught dozens of children over the years and recognized real hunger when she saw it. The competition became the fixed point around which everything else organized itself. Extra Saturday sessions, a formal piece Claire selected with unusual care, a slow rebuilding of trust between father and daughter's teacher that neither one acknowledged out loud, but both quietly extended. Lesson by lesson, because Sophie's happiness had become a kind of shared project neither of them was willing to jeopardize with old wounds. It was during one of these Saturday sessions that the fracture in Claire's careful composure widened into something Ethan could no longer ignore. He'd arrived early to pick Sophie up and found Claire in the studio's small back office. On the phone, her voice pitched into a register he hadn't heard from her in 15 years. Controlled panic dressed up as calm. She hung up quickly when she saw him in the doorway, but not quickly enough to hide the tremor in her hands as she set the phone down. And when he asked, carefully, if everything was all right, she gave him the same practiced non-answer she'd given him once before. It's complicated. It's nothing you need to worry about. He didn't push. He'd learned, from watching his own grief, that people reveal things on their own schedule or not at all. The truth surfaced sideways, the way it usually does, through someone who hadn't meant to be the one to tell it. Claire's older brother, Daniel, ran into Ethan by chance at the hardware store where Ethan still worked weekend shifts, and Daniel, who had never been good at keeping his sister's confidences, and had spent 15 years quietly regretting his own silence about what really happened, said more than he meant to over a conversation about paint chips and drywall screws. He told Ethan, haltingly, that Claire hadn't left because she'd stopped loving him. She'd left because their father, a man with a long and dangerous history of gambling debts to people who did not forgive debts easily, had threatened to make Ethan a target if Claire didn't cut all ties and disappear cleanly. No explanation, nothing that could be traced back or used as leverage. Daniel said Claire had spent that entire final year negotiating quietly with their father to keep the threat contained, that she'd broken her own engagement and rebuilt her life from nothing specifically so that nobody who mattered to her would ever be endangered by association. Daniel said he'd carried the guilt of watching her do that alone for 15 years and staying silent about it the whole time, because Claire had made him swear never to tell. Ethan stood in the paint aisle holding a color swatch he no longer saw, recalculating the entire architecture of the last 15 years in real time. Every unanswered question, every night he'd told himself he simply hadn't been enough, rearranged itself around a truth that was both more frightening and far less personal than anything he'd imagined. She hadn't left because of something broken in him. She'd left to keep him alive. That same week, a second crisis compounded the first. Sophie, overtired from the accelerated competition schedule and picking up, in the unspoken way children do, on the tension crackling between the two adults she now trusted most outside her own family, had a meltdown before a Saturday lesson, crying that she didn't want to compete anymore, that the music didn't feel like hers anymore, that she was scared of disappointing everybody. It took both Ethan and Claire working together in a way neither had planned, sitting on either side of her on the studio bench, to talk her back down. Claire reminding her gently that the music had always belonged to her and no one else. Ethan simply holding his daughter's hand and saying nothing, which was, as it had always been, his particular way of saying everything. It was the first time in 15 years the three of them had occupied the same emotional space without armor. And something in Claire's chest broke quietly open watching this father, still so careful with his own damage, be so unguarded with his child. She sought him out afterward in the parking lot, while Sophie packed up her things inside. She did not apologize, not exactly. She said instead that there were things she should have told him a long time ago, that she was finally ready to say them if he was willing to hear them. No conditions, no ask for forgiveness attached. Ethan, who already knew more than she realized, told her only that he was listening. 1 month would pass before either of them found the right evening to actually say the things that had waited 15 years to be spoken. And by the time they did, the truth would arrive with a cost neither of them had fully priced in. The evening it finally happened was unremarkable in every outward way. A Tuesday, overcast. Sophie asleep at a friend's house for a rare sleepover. The studio closed and dim except for a single lamp near the piano where Claire had asked Ethan to meet her. She told him the whole of it that night, in full, without the shorthand Daniel had used at the hardware store. Her father's debts. The men who had come to the house twice threatening not her, but whoever she loved most. The ultimatum she'd been given with no room to negotiate. The note she'd left, and the number she'd disconnected because a clean break, however brutal, was the only version of the story that kept Ethan out of a danger he'd never known existed. She told him she had spent the years since building a life deliberately small and unremarkable. A modest studio, a modest apartment, no attachments large enough to threaten again, because some part of her equation for safety had never stopped running in the background. She told him, finally, that seeing him walk into her studio with a 9-year-old daughter and a grief of his own had felt less like coincidence and more like a debt finally coming due. A chance to be honest with him, even if it changed nothing. Ethan did not raise his voice. He never did. He sat with what she'd told him for a long moment, turning it over the way he turned over an unfamiliar tool before using it. And then he said the thing that mattered most to him, plainly, that he understood why she'd done it. And that understanding didn't erase the 15 years it had cost them both, but that he no longer needed her to apologize for choosing to protect him. What he needed, he said, was for her to stop making that same choice now, to stop offering, every time things got complicated, to quietly remove herself from a room rather than stay in it, and let someone else decide if the complication was worth it. He told her that was the real habit she needed to break, not the leaving 15 years ago, but the leaving she kept rehearsing every time something got hard now. It was, in its way, more devastating to Claire than any accusation could have been, because it named precisely the thing she'd never let herself examine, that protecting people disappearing had become less a rescue and more a reflex, one she'd used again just months earlier, when she'd offered to hand Sophie off to another teacher, rather than sit in a room with her own discomfort. She had spent 15 years being brave about the wrong things, and cowardly about the one thing that actually mattered, staying. The regional piano competition arrived 3 weeks later, and it was there that the last piece of the story unraveled in front of an audience neither Ethan nor Claire had anticipated. Sophie had chosen, with Claire's quiet blessing, to perform an original arrangement she'd built herself out of a lullaby her mother used to hum, a detail Claire had drawn out of her gently over months of lessons without either Ethan or Sophie fully realizing how much grief and love had gone into 8 measures of music. Watching his daughter play something she had built out of her mother's memory, in a hall full of strangers, with the woman who had once vanished from his life, now sitting quietly 2 seats down with tears she wasn't hiding. Ethan understood that whatever this new configuration of people in his life was, it had stopped being about old wounds and started being about the family. Sophie was quietly, deliberately building for herself out of whoever showed up and stayed. Sophie did not win the competition outright. She placed second, beaten by a technically flawless performance from an older student. But the adjudicators singled out her arrangement by name during the awards remarks, calling it the most emotionally honest piece performed that day. And Sophie, beaming in a way Ethan hadn't seen since before Rachel got sick, ran off the stage and directly into Claire's arms before she reached her father's. An instinct so natural and unthinking that it told both adults, more clearly than any conversation could have, exactly where things now stood. 2 months would pass, ordinary and unhurried, before Ethan finally asked Claire the question that would either close the story completely or open it all the way back up. Whether she'd be willing to stop protecting him from a life she was allowed to actually be part of. He asked her on a Sunday. Not the studio this time, but his own kitchen, Sophie's competition ribbon pinned crookedly to the refrigerator behind them. A pot of coffee going cold between them because neither one had touched it. He didn't dress the question up. He told her he wasn't asking her to erase 15 years, or pretend they hadn't happened, only that he was asking her plainly to consider staying. Not as Sophie's piano teacher, not as an old complication he was managing, but as someone he wanted in the ordinary, unremarkable middle of his life. The part that wasn't dramatic or urgent, just daily. Claire sat with the question longer than she needed to, out of habit more than doubt, and then she told him the truth as simply as she knew how, that she had spent 15 years mistaking self-erasure for love, and that she was finally ready to learn the difference, starting with him, if he'd let her. There was no grand public reveal, no gathered crowd of witnesses the way these stories sometimes resolve. The real reckoning had already happened quietly, in a dim studio on a Tuesday night, and everything after that was simply two people choosing, day by day, to keep showing up, rather than perform the reunion for anyone else's benefit. When the studio's owner, impressed by Sophie's competition placement, offered Claire a promotion to lead instructor with a raise and her name on the front window, Claire accepted the role, but asked for one adjustment. Instead of the showcase recital the studio wanted to build around her, she asked to start a free Saturday morning program for kids who'd lost a parent. No fee, no pressure, just an hour of music and a room where grief was allowed to be loud or silent, whichever it needed to be that week. It was, everyone who knew her agreed, exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous request Claire Bennett would make. Months later, on an ordinary evening with no significance to anyone but the three of them, Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Claire lean over Sophie's shoulder at the old upright piano they'd bought secondhand for the living room, guiding his daughter's hands through a piece that wasn't for any competition, wasn't for anyone's benefit at all, just for the pleasure of playing it. Claire caught his eye over Sophie's head and didn't say anything, and she didn't need to. The 4 words she'd said in that studio doorway all those months ago had finally stopped being an ending revisited and become, instead, an ordinary Tuesday kind of true. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, let it be this. The people who disappear from our lives are not always the ones who stop loving us, and the ones who stay are not always the ones who never made mistakes. Sometimes the whole of a love story is contained in the difference between protecting someone by leaving and finally, belatedly, protecting them by staying instead. If you believe the overlooked, the quiet, the ones who carried their love silently for years deserve a second chance to say it out loud, consider staying with us here. Subscribing if this story found you the way it was meant to, because there is always another quiet person out there whose story hasn't been told yet, and we intend to keep telling them. Stay close for the final truth still waiting at the very end of this one.